Welcome back to the county seat. Our topic today is taking a look at different ways to manage forests. And a conversation has been brewing off and on for a couple of years of saying somehow or another we have to get the conversation back to a thing where the Forest Service just doesn't have to pay to keep a forest in non-burnable state, keep it healthy, but rather find a way to blend the old style method, the Pinchot method of making money off the forest by planting harvests of trees and preserving the balance of the forest. So there's been some talk and there have been comparisons about different entities on public lands and how they work, and we're going to kind of blend that into a concept who's really been pioneered in part by Kane County Commissioner Jim Matson, who has a long and extensive background in forestry. And Jim, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We had a current forester consultant who was supposed to be with us today, but last-minute health issues stopped him from joining us. We're going to carry on without him. So I will try to play devil's advocate for some of the things that Tom talked about that didn't quite align with yours, but we'll get into a conversation.
Okay.
So let's start right with the title. You're talking about forest stewardships. Explain the concept.
And also coupled with community forest stewardship, you know. So what we want to do is kind of couple, if we can, our forested landscapes with those communities that are in and around and adjacent to these large forest tracts. They're the direct beneficiaries today, and they also ought to have a role in what the direction is as we go ahead and manage toward healthy forests in a sustainable fashion.
Okay, so you know, there are a lot of people who say it's sustainable if you throw more money at it and you pay the Forest Service to go in and do controlled burns and you know, harvest out diseased trees and do some of these things, but it all seems to have a price tag on it. And it's been very frustrating over the years to say there used to be a commercial value in this fiber that's growing in the forest, and we used to take advantage of it. And in the early 1800s, I guess we took advantage of it or misused that privilege by just clear cutting and moving on. But I think the Forest Service and the forest industry has grown up in the last 150 years, have they not?
They really have, and things have evolved somewhat, you know, since, let's say, World War II. You know, in my previous life and background in the forest products industry, there used to be 5 or 6 different companies that would be bidding for these tracts of forest to harvest and to take the material out so that they in turn could produce products as such. So over time we've lost the ability of that forest industry to compete and to do a job for the nation, the country, the communities that they're around. And that's self-inflicted. We've done that through lawsuits, we've done that through NEPA, and we've just choked the whole thing down to the point right now is who would want to take that kind of risk?
Yeah, but Jim, people would look at that and say, well, yeah, but you can't just have them come in and pay cents on the dollar for wood and denude a forest and just leave it sitting there. You know, how the tree's going to come back?
Well, in actuality, forestry, thank God, happens in spite of us. You turn around 20 years later and there's trees growing behind you where you've been, you know, where you're going forward. So I think we need to recognize that it's got a certain growing capacity and capability, and it's there as such. So it's going to really require that we do the kind of things that really enhance natural processes and not just lose it in an insect attack or in a large fire.
So there would be some people who would argue that if you clear cut an area, you've scarred its natural beauty. And so it seems to me that the argument really is about aesthetics, that the environmental and recreational community say, well, we don't want that forest mowed down. So what's your answer to that?
Let's say that I was a 25 or 30-year-old forester and I was given a tract of, let's say, 80,000 acres to manage. Mm-hmm. In a career, in a 30, 40-year career, I could change the character, the structure, and the nature of that whole forest stand, and you wouldn't know it at the end of that 40-year period.
How would I not know it? I mean, some people would say, well, how dare you think that you should change Mother Nature?
If you can go in there in such a way and remove the trees that in one sense or another are either out of phase or are not contributing to the overall picture. But what I'm talking about is that we could do it in such a fashion that most of us are windshield observers. And as you drive to and through the forest over a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades, that forest character can change if we don't see it. But if you have a large area that's been cut over or clear cut, as you said earlier, right away you know what's happened to it. But a large fire is as devastating as a big clear cut. So we've got to deal with the natural presence of that forest, its forest structure, and what it's contributing.
Okay, so let's take an example of this. Let's look at West Yellowstone. Okay, the Yellowstone Fire was it was a game changer for public lands, and they said, well, we're going to let it burn, it's going to be natural, we're not going to fight it. And it wiped out that tall stand of lodgepole pines that you used to basically drive through a lodgepole tunnel till you got to the Madison River Junction. Mm-hmm. And then it was all gone. It was nothing but cinders, and even most of the tree trunks within a period of 2 or 3 years toppled over, and you just had a barren landscape. Mm-hmm. It's now been, what, 35, 40 years since that fire? When was that, 87 or something like that?
Yeah, it's 30 plus, yes.
30 plus years, and you just now are at a point where you have what I would call a young, maturing forest. Mm-hmm. You don't have any tall trees, none, and they're probably 60, 70 trees per acre, and there's other growth in there, but the trees are starting to become predominant in that landscape again, but not tall. Okay, if you're talking about the community stewardship program where somebody is selectively trying to maintain it, how different does his project look than that one?
I think when you have those kind of disruptive structural changes, you're going to be able to tell it and notice that over time. But let's say that we decide that we're going to harvest with a group selection approach to it. And so we're taking a look at this clump of trees and its age and its structure and this one and this one. And we're going to say basically we want to be able to take and move this mosaic around over time, and you thin it out so that you'll always have a forested canopy over top. But there will be so many trees per acre, whether it's 20 or 80 at any one stage or the other. But as you remove material, you take material out that has commercial value. It helps pay for the processes, and you don't have to go to the banks of the Potomac to borrow money. That's my approach to this thing as far as federal budgets. You know.
Right. Do you think it's actually self-sustainable, where the cost of maintaining the forest because of the product pulled out
Absolutely.
Is going to equal the cost to maintain it?
Absolutely. And it was going on before until we got tied up into these NEPA battles over the NGOs and their approach to wanting to be able to determine outcomes. And what happens? We stalled the whole thing out.
Is that what happened in the Dixie?
The Dixie and the Fish Lake and Yellowstone.
Okay, and so explain how that process worked. What happened there?
There was an approach toward managing forested areas that would say that in a given period of time that the removals would equal, let's say, 10, 15 million feet per year. Mm-hmm. And if you kept that on a steady schedule, and it should be less than millions of board feet per year, but more about acres treated, and the objectives that we're going to put in on the ground for the watersheds and the tree species that are there, then we would be looking at the means by which, how do we then make those selections and do it in a cogent enough fashion so that the courts and NEPA challenges don't unnecessarily, the appeals and lawsuits, choke it down.
So how different is that, doing this community stewardship program, how is that different than just doing timber sales to achieve that goal through the Forest Service?
I think when you hang a commercial label on it, it naturally takes on an air of skepticism as opposed to something that would say the beneficiaries of this are the families, the communities that are in and around that need the tourism, that need that wood material, and that need to have jobs for their people. And the way to do this thing is to say basically you have working circles. Mm-hmm. And here's another working circle. And in the areas there, then you determine a forest management approach to whether it's going to be a selective harvest or it's going to be even age harvest or whatever it takes. And then you say, this is what we're going to offer. But you're also going to say to that particular community, you come up with your family stewards mm-hmm. that are going to live there and are going to take on these contracts and these jobs to do this thing. There's a working model for this right now, and it's called grazing. We're doing that with grazing allotments, and they're allowed to take so many AUMs off of that landscape in a given period of time. This simply mirrors that same approach. So as to whether you had 4 or 5 contract entities, or you had one large or one mill, they would be responsible for going out, making an assessment, and then making an offer back to the forest and saying, we're going to do X in this period of time, and we'll pay you this for it.
And so they would actually be paying for the process, kind of like when they would do timber sales, except that it would be over a longer period of time?
It over a period of time, but there would be annual increments based on what's removed. And that would be to some prescription that actually enhances the situation so that you don't end up with a forest that's standing ready to collapse through either a insect attack and or fire.
So what does a healthy forest look like?
Well, that's a good one, because to me it has several age classes in it, scattered around on it. You might even have 2 or 3 different species, but you look up in the crowns and you can tell because they're all cone shaped. But if they're topped off and flat and no foliage, that particular forest is going through a phase where it's going to eventually drop or collapse.
Really?
Yes.
So to get that cone shape, the trees, if I'm guessing, they need light, and so you got to have them thin enough that they can fill out at the bottom and create that cone shape at the top of the trees.
And moisture, and some trees need more shade than others. Other tree species need more sunlight, so you get a mixture of that as you go along through that.
Does it have open space in the middle of it?
It sure does, and sure can, and sure should. And an edge in the interior.
Okay, so between now and the time we tape this and the time we go to air, can you think of your mind some pictures that we could be showing on the screen that shows what a healthy section of forest looks like in your mind, with the multi-species and the clumps and this whole picture, and what a current forest looks like that we think a forest should be as basically recreational consumers?
As opposed to the overall condition, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we'll pretend like that and explain to me what the difference is.
Well, why don't we start out with a forest tract that basically has brush and grass and so on, and it's got seed trees inside and around. And the seed trees themselves can be anything from, let's say, 100 to 150 years in age. And they're producing cones, they're producing seeds. Pine cones and pine seeds typically take 2 years as far as the process is concerned. So you need site conditions on the ground so that when those seedlings drop, they land, the moisture is there at the time, and then they sprout, and then you got tree seedlings that come up. And then over a period of time you have a clump of seedlings. And then next thing you know, they'll grow over time and say 5, 10, 15 years into pole-sized stands, and right on up into what it's small saw timber, small saw trees particularly, and then the larger ones. And then at a particular point in time when it's restocked, so that it goes from, let's say, having anything from 80 to 100 trees per acre. As it thins itself out, you probably end up with a net number of trees out there somewhere around 40. And that acre has enough moisture and enough sunlight and other conditions that allows it, with its own productivity, to grow up over that period of time. And then it goes on into something that can be 18 and 24 and 36 inches in diameter, and 80 to 150 feet tall. And
then you pull those trees out and selectively, and so you basically have within a 60 or 70 acre area a little bit of everything.
Yes.
Some old trees that are ready to be harvested, some trees that are just coming into that cone producing area, a little bit of separation for fire breaks. Is that kind of how that picture works?
In actuality, what you want to do is have it in such a condition so that you don't have fuel ladders from the littlest trees to the next size trees, so that when the ground fire comes through the grass, it goes to the top. So you need breaks in there so that it does not do that, and you have time to react to a ground fire.
Now, some people are going to think a break is just a bulldozed road or something like that, but it basically is just saying that you go from very short to very tall. Does that serve as a break?
Interspaced with grasses, forbs, and brush. Oak, for example, gamble oak would be another one. So those are all things that contribute to that particular mosaic as you select for those conditions over 150, 100, 200 year period. The problem is that we don't live to be 300 years old.
Right.
We look at it through the eyes of what we see right now today without realizing there's other conditions coming. So that's the opportunity that's out there.
So do you think that a lot of this environmental meandering into land policy has to do with the fact that we're looking at a life cycle that's 300 years and we're trying to interpret it into 70?
Or 20 to 70, or whatever the
Right.
case may be. Yes, I think we're just very, if you will, short-sighted, without knowing what the end result could possibly be.
So wouldn't an environmentalist benefit from learning from a forester who understands that?
I'd love to do that. And I think there's a whole host of trained foresters or educated foresters that could possibly do that. So we have to realize, I think our objectives are basically as to what benefits that community and the people and the families that are there. But at the same time, what benefits the environmental movement as they look at trying to keep their NGOs financially healthy. We need to figure out a way to make sure those guys are supportive and involved as well.
Well, I mean, if my own personal bias is if they'd engage themselves in doing instead of complaining a little bit more, things might improve, but I'm not sure that, I know, that's a bias. I know I'll get flack for that. But
I share that.
But in essence, what you're telling me then is that all of these objections, the court order,